Commemoration is just eat the my and scotch more Shayak Irish. You know, we haven't been able to come here for the last few years, but there was always somebody came here on each of the COVID years, you know, and I've got to thank Phil McPhillips, a few of us came last year, and so we kept the memory alive, but we've lost so many people who would have been key to this commemorative event every year, and we think especially of Eugene McCabe, who has died since in the course of COVID, and this was a very special place for Eugene and a very special project, and he worked with Peter McLeod and Sean Slowey over here and with the rest and Gabby oh, I was going to mention that, Gabby, don't you worry. There were so many people who put so many years of effort into this long before it got going at all, and they raised the money for this beautiful and poignant memorial that you see here, and for the wider kind of, and of course we're always indebted to Tony McGahey and to the McGahey family for their generosity in seeing the significance of this site, because we're standing in a place where there are over 6,000 bodies interred of people who died in the workhouse that stood here where the meat factory is now. And I think it is, Sean Slowey will correct me on the exact figure, but 1,500 of those died in the course of those few years between 1846 and 1850, during what we call the famine years, or in Gorta, the Great Hunger. You know, so many of them died there, and they were only a fraction of the people, because we know from the demolition of the fever hospital, which stood outside the original walls of the workhouse, we know that many other people weren't even brought here. They were simply buried in pits immediately outside the wall. And Peter McLeod here, the chair of this committee, and this most long-standing member, I think he deserves a pension on it at this stage. But Peter was part of a ceremony just a few years ago when the fever hospital was tossed. All these remains were discovered in underneath. I think it was 17 bodies? 13 bodies, which are buried up close to where Sean Slowey is standing there with his lovely dog. And it's you know, so it's a reminder that even what the people who were brought here in the dead cart, and they were brought here maybe 20, 30 people, we know the last records from this workhouse are around March of 1847. Why? Because the whole thing collapses here. Clones at that stage, Clones Workhouse, which served the Clones Town, Scots House, Connans, Dromully, Wattle Bridge, Newton Butler, Maharavili, Adramsea, Rosslea, Mahararney, and around to Cleven, this side of Cleven, Nublis. All of that area was absolutely destroyed in this area here. There were 2,000 empty houses in 1851 that had been recorded as inhabited in 1841. That was the devastation. And it wasn't just the deaths in the workhouse here, or the deaths on the ditches outside, or on the public works. It was the awful emigration that happened during that period. No more so than in the Maharavili area, which of all of the parishes around Clones, of all the districts around Clones, suffered the greatest population loss, followed closely probably by Dromully, by the Connans district, and Scots House. Absolutely awful. But it has been such a fantastic thing to be part of this project since, I suppose, about 1999, since the committee asked me to write a wee history of Clones Poor Law Union and what happened. And it was such a vibrant committee. I remember with Sean McQuillan, this is the book, Peter's shown it to me, said there are copies available. All money's towards this. It's a €10, it's a steal. €10, and all money's paid for this here go towards the maintenance of this memorial and towards the wider commemoration of the victims of the Great Hunger in this area. But do I hold on? I'll hold on to it. So I see the McQuillans here, Sean McQuillan again, Gabby Bonner, as was said, you know, so many great people have been part of this committee over now more than 25, 26, 27 years. It's like a life sentence. But you know, we are indebted to them for what they left us, and left us here in this beautiful memorial that provides a focus now for us every year to come here and remember those who perished and those who were forced to leave this area as a result of the catastrophe, the man-made catastrophe. As they say, God sent the blade of blight, but the famine was a human construct. There was lots of food. There was tons of food. It was exported. It was beyond the reach of the poor people, and the poor people died. The poor people died, and then other people died through the diseases attached to this catastrophe. So we're very, very fortunate this year to have a number of eloquent speakers. We have a husband and wife team for the first time, and I'm going to invite Fergus O'Connor to come up maybe and do the talk first, and then we're going to have Geraldine. And both Fergus, of course, is a Clonus man anyway, and Geraldine, they're very much involved in the Cluain Heritage Group. And
Get out before evening. Okay, I'm glad that Brian talked about immigration, because that was the topic I kind of chose to speak on. And basically, during the famine period, there was up to about 500,000 evictions done, and the evictions were accomplished generally in two different ways. The first way was generally to kind of get I'm not used to the microphone in class, Brian. Okay. Sorry. That's brilliant. Thanks very much. The first involved getting a legal judgment against the male head of the household, and when you got the verdict, which you inevitably did get, he was thrown into jail and the family was thrown out onto the wayside. The second one was the landlord, who would simply pay for the fare to take families overseas, to particularly what's called British North America, what we're supposed to call now Canada. The landlords generally made phony promises about, when you get there, there'll be an agent there to look after you, and they'll have so much money for you, and food and clothing, just to kind of get you settled in and that. But of course, they lied. They knew there was no comeback for the Irish immigrants. Once they got out there was virtually no way of coming back. So they knew they were quite safe in doing that. So the first coffin ships headed for Quebec in Canada, and 3,000-mile journey depended on winds basically and the captain's skills, and it took generally anything from 40 days to 3 months. So I've just got a wee bit on the conditions, which you can guess were horrendous. The shipping laws in Britain weren't as strict as other ones at all, so they were very, very lax. So you got ships of every size and shape were coming out of Liverpool and other ports crammed full of people, sometimes double the capacity. In one case, an unseaworthy ship sailed out of Liverpool, and within sight of the port, it kind of sank, and within sight of those who had just said goodbye to the immigrants, So in the transatlantic voyage, the ships had to they were required by law to kind of have 7 pounds of food per passenger per week. Now, it was assumed that most passengers would bring their own food with them, but a lot of the poor Irish obviously had none, so basically they were on a pound of food a day, which basically came down to starvation rations, just above starvation. The problem, Brian mentioned it as well, it's typhus. Typhus was a fever which was very infectious, and the doctors were supposed to watch the people as they came on board the ships to make sure that they were okay and healthy, but should have passed everybody. It's even said that people on the verge of death were passed for going aboard the ship, so it wasn't too thin. British ships were not required by law to have a doctor on board, so anyone that died during the sea voyage was literally, the body was dumped overboard, and there was no religious rites or anything like that. The conditions themselves then, below decks, you had hundreds of men, women and children kind of huddled together, generally in the dark on bare wooden floors with no ventilation, breathing a stench of vomit and the effects of diarrhea, and with no sanitary facilities. So it was just, I suppose, literally a hellhole. On ships that actually had sleeping berths, there was no mattresses or anything like that, and a sleeping berth was roughly maybe 6 foot by 6 foot, and that would have 4 people in it, so not much room there. Sorry, I just have to switch back again. So the first coffin ships, as I said, headed for Quebec, and they had to come up the St. Lawrence River, and the ships were to be stopped at a place called Grosse Ile, the French for Big Island. And the Canadian immigration officials didn't have any say over the policies. The policies were done by the British colonial authorities, so that the Canadian immigration officials had to do with whatever facilities they had. And as I said, the little place that they had only beds for 150, and they didn't realise what was soon be coming at them, I'm afraid. So by the spring of 1847, shipload after shipload of Irish immigrants had arrived, and it quickly overwhelmed the whole thing. As I said, they only had 150 beds, and the Irish were coming in thick and fast. By June, there was 40 vessels stretching nearly 2 miles down the St. Lawrence River, waiting to kind of be passed for quarantine and all the rest. And it took up to 5 days to see a doctor before that, and in lots of cases the doctors became infected with typhus as well. It's very infected. It's passed by lice, okay, so it's very infectious that way. By the summer, the line of ships had grown to several miles long, so you can imagine the confusion in that. So they had a 15-day general quarantine was then imposed, that everybody had to stay there for at least 15 days. So even people who had made it across the Atlantic and were quite healthy, because they were on board typhus infected ships, they then caught it because of the extra weight they had to do and died because of it. The people who died on board the ships were dumped into the St. Lawrence. Others half alive were placed in small boats and dropped on the beaches and that. And some of them managed to crawl literally on their hands and knees up to the hospitals. They had erected at this stage fever sheds, which were large wooden structures, very unsanitary, very understaffed, and people were lying 3 to a bed, and quite often the person next to you would be a corpse, quite often after the night before. So it wasn't exactly heaven. So those who couldn't get into the hospitals just died on the roadsides. It's estimated that 5,000 people died in Gross Eel. It was the disease that 30 of their number were stricken down, and 13 died the death of martyrs. There was no faltering, no holding back. No sooner were the ranks thinned by death than the gaps were quickly filled. And when the grey nuns were driven to the last extremity, the Sisters of Providence came to their assistance and took their place by the side of the dying strangers. But when even their aid did not suffice to meet the emergency, the Sisters of St. Joseph, although they were a cloistered order, received the permission of the bishop to share with their sister religious the hardships and dangers of labour by day or night. So there was certainly plenty of help at that end. And all the records, those grey nuns, took handwritten records, and you can have access to them. Well, first of all, they were translated because they were done in French, were transcribed and then digitised, so they're available in Famine archives in NUA Galway. If you want to look it up, some of the stuff, some of what they saw and what they did was absolutely harrowing. In 1859, this is so many years later, in Montreal, they were building a famous bridge there called Victoria Bridge, and they came across some mass graves. And a lot of the workers were of Irish descent, so they were very unsettled by the whole thing, so they wanted to make a memorial to all those who had died there, because basically the area was kind of a site, it was just one big mass grave. So they had taken a 30-ton stone boulder from the river, which was black, and it was about 10 foot high. So they put it there as a memorial to commemorate and remember all those who had died there. It's called the Black Rock. Now, there's a ceremony every year there done. The Irish Canadians, under the stewardship of the ancient order of Hibernians, have a commemoration there every year to the Black Rock. Obviously not during the COVID and that, but it's usually on the last Sunday in May, so we're not that much different there. So they're commemorating the dead over there as well. So somebody else, sorry, I have different quotations and not catching my eye as I come along. An historian at the time basically summarised it as says, they came for a new life and found a grave instead. Okay, so I think that summed that wee bit up. Sorry, I'll get back now to the rest of it.
Around the memorial here, on behalf of Cluain's Family Committee, for me and Margaret. Oh, there's more there. We like to focus on wildflowers. For Emil we like to focus on wildflowers, not there, because as you'll see, there wasn't much thought of the people buried here. This site isn't on any map. It doesn't appear on any map. These were less than almost subhuman, you know, in that there's no recognition of them. There are no graves. The people here are buried in pits. They were buried in pits with lime thrown in on top of them, you know, obviously with the numbers that were coming in every day. Like the dead cart in Cluain was carrying maybe 13, 14, 15 people a day up here to be buried. This is at the height of the Great Hunger, you know. So we like to commemorate with wildflowers every year. So if you are coming back in other years, you know, if you could pick a few, it would be lovely. And of course, another thing about the wildflowers is that they were important to the people as food and as medicine. This was their only treatment, you know, the wild herbal treatment. I brought along one. Hold on a wee second, if I have it here. Yeah. So I brought along one little wildflower that was very important to the people in those periods, and yet a lot of you know it as silverweed, but it's brisclawn in Irish, brisclawn. And brisclawn was used by the people to make a kind of a poor sort of porridge or bread or dough for bread, you know. So it's just one of those wild herbs that you see along the hedgerow or whatever that was central to the people's lives, because between the end of the potato crop in any year, even in a good year, and the next potato crop, there were the hungry months. So people relied on things like this here to sustain them, as an addition to their diet. So it's such a simple flower. It's a beautiful little yellow flower, and it's ubiquitous in the landscape. But now when I see it, and knowing that, I think of its function, as well as the fact that obviously it's got a wider function within nature. So maybe now we'll ask Geraldine, who's going to talk
a wee bit lower. Thank you, Brian. And I want to take this opportunity on behalf of Cluain Heritage Group, our chairman and also our treasurer here today, and possibly some other members, for inviting us to be associated with this year's Cluain Famine Commemoration event. It's truly a lovely setting, and it's so peaceful. Many years ago, Brian mentioned Sean, and I'll also mention he was our chairperson and our then treasurer, Kevin McPhillips, along with Father Corrigan. We took part in the National Famine Commemoration in, I think it was 2011. And we did all the little walks in from the villages, and we met up here, and there was a tree planting ceremony, and Kathy and Geraldine are here, and Sean and Kevin and Father planted one of the trees that was taken from the parish of Cluain by Kevin, and it was planted here, and I think it's still in the hedgerow. So it's always good to be associated and for communities to come together and to remember. And Brian talked about those who died and those who went away, and it was such a terrible, terrible loss to our community and to our people. But I'm just looking around here. I remember my children reading the story Under the Hawthorn Tree to them when they were children over 30, maybe 35 years ago. And our own youngest grandchild was at a recent event of Under the Hawthorn Tree, I think in Monaghan there. She's only 9. So the memories are continuing, and it's so important to keep those memories alive. And I was thinking as well when I was thinking of here, because we do come here at times and have a quiet time, and Under the Hawthorn Tree, the opening of that is where the little 10-month-old child Bridget dies and is buried under a hawthorn tree in the garden of the house before the mother and the family are gone, and then the 3 other children go in search of aunts and a better life and someone to help them. But then I thought, here's the hawthorn trees, and we're under the hawthorn trees here today, along with all of those thousands of people who are with us in spirit. And the hawthorn tree, Brian spoke there of the herbs and the flowers and that, but the hawthorn tree in Irish culture and part of our psyche, they're portals to the other world. So that child was buried under the hawthorn tree, and these people here are people that we're all part of. They're buried under the hawthorn trees, which were portals to the other world and to a better life for them. But as Brian said, Fergus has spoken about the people who went west and the people who went east. And I just wanted to remember, because I suppose I'm a member of ICA Women's Organisation, and Brian's mum also, Mama, would have always been a great advocate of women. And I thought of the girls who went, the young orphans, the children, who were aged between 14 and 18. And they were taken from the workhouses all across Ireland, including this one. So I've written a few wee pieces, not an awful lot, but it's amazing. We were talking to Fergus's cousins, and if this goes online, and hello to Maureen and John only an hour ago, and I said I was going to talk about the Earl Grey scheme, and they didn't know about it, even though Maureen had been brought up in Australia. She wasn't born there, and so different people have even mentioned here. I've mentioned the Earl Grey, and they weren't aware of the Earl Grey scheme. So I think it's important that we remember, as well as those people who passed away and died in such horrific circumstances, the girls who lived in horrific circumstances and were sent then away, and probably they thought it was so much better for them, because they got lovely clothes, well, nice clothes anyway, to go on their long journey. But I'm not as good at numbers and figures as Fergus, so I write things down. So if you bear with me, I'll just give you a wee outline of what the children, the orphan girls from Ireland, what their journey in life was. So I want also to thank Anne Corley in the Cassandra Hands Centre, who helped me when I went looking for information. And a lot of what I have here I want to acknowledge to Carrick McCross Workhouse Records as well, because I took quite a lot of that. I like to get things right if I'm doing it, so hopefully I have, and I do them justice. In early 1848, Governor Robe of South Australia, he sent a request to Lord Earl Grey. He was the Secretary of State for the colonies, and Governor Robe asked Lord Earl Grey to renew and increase the government-assisted emigration from Britain to South Australia and to New South Wales. So Lord Grey, he devised a scheme which became known as the Earl Grey scheme, whereby 4,114 young orphan girls were sent from Ireland. There were girls sent from England and Scotland and other places around Great Britain, but it was 4,114 young Irish orphan girls between the ages of 14 and 18 were sent to Australia in a 2-year period, 1848 to 1850. And the Board of Guardians, which would have included here, they were charged with meeting the cost of the children's transport from here to Plymouth in England, which is where the ships sailed from. And they also had to meet the cost of the clothing and the little box containers that the clothing went in. So in February of 1848, it was decided to increase the number of ships to be dispatched from Plymouth from 54 to 72. And they were going out at a rate of 6 a month. Now, the Irish girls went on 20 of those ships. So part of the agreement, as Fergus said, in the other ships going...
And this year we thought actually the Hawthorn would be the focus of this year's commemoration in a way, partly because recently the young dramatists in Monaghan, the young drama group, put on a performance of Under the Hawthorn Tree, a dramatic performance of it, and we're very, very fortunate to have with us today. I'll call on my neighbour agus, how will she inish, Dervla McCormick, and Dervla will be followed by Ronan McPhillips, Finton's Ronan. So Dervla, could you come forward maybe and read your section? So we're going to have 2 short readings from Under the Hawthorn Tree, and a part of a reflection maybe of all of the fiction that has been inspired, if you like, by the suffering of Gorta Moor, and and sometimes fictional writing can capture the emotion, the feeling better than the raw history, So, Dervla, right yeah, Hashka.
The book's quite short and sweet, so I'll try to give you a bit of a match. He kept walking on. 2 or 3 times he felt dizzy and lightheaded and had to sit down to get his breath back. He could hear the river water running, but still he could not see it. Then, up ahead, he was able to make out the crossroads and the humpy bridge. 2 women lay on the ground near the bridge. They were both so weak they didn't notice the young boy past them. Michael couldn't believe it when he came to the old man. Crowds of people were waiting, sleeping on the cobblestones. They could go no further. A few of them were grouped together in families. They lay in their rags or blankets, relieved just not to be on their own. From within the building came the constant moaning and crying and smell of disease and sickness that seemed to fill the air around the place. Some people were praying out loud. A nun, dressed in full habit, came through a small wooden door. She spoke in a loud voice. "This place is full. We have no space for man, nor woman, nor child, nor is there spare food. Perhaps by tomorrow, when we have removed those who died of the sickness and of the fever, we may be able to take a few." A murmur ran through the crowd, and the women began to wail and cry. They had no place left to go, and here was as good as any place to die as anywhere else. At least they might get a blessing said over them. Michael began to run. He didn't know where the energy came from. Down, past the bridge, and back the way it had come from. Tears coursed down his face. He could feel a pain in his chest, and he knew that his heart was broken in two and his childhood gone forever. He slowed down. He had a long and miserable way to go. There was no God, and if there was, he was a monster.
I asked Ronan and Ish, my hip. Is this what you do? I'll bracket.
Eilidh could not believe the crowds when they reached the village. Hundreds of ragged, starving people thronged the main street. They queued, desperate for food. Some were so weak they could not stand, so they sat on the ground, dejected but determined to keep their place. The children fell into line at the very back. Eilidh's eyes roved over the crowd, searching to see if she could pick out any familiar face. The faces. She would never forget them. They all had the same look. The cheeks were sunken, the eyes wide and staring with deep circles underneath, the lips narrow and tight. And in some, the skin had a yellow tinge. Hunger and sickness had changed these people. Now they were like ghosts. Old women clawed and tried to push their way to get further up the line. Mothers stood staring ahead as scrawny toddlers pulled and whined against their filthy skirts. This must be hell, thought Eilidh, for once really terrified. Suddenly in the distance, 3 women with aprons and caps emerged from the doors of a ramshackle shed, lifting a large heavy cauldron. Immediately the crowd surged forward. Eilidh just managed to grab a hold of Peggy, whose feet were actually lifted off the ground in the panic. Peggy fastened her arms against Eilidh's waist and rested her head against her chest. She was exhausted and scared.
It's just absolutely beautiful.
Every year we come here, one of the things we try to do is to do a floral kind of a memorial to under 5 foot tall, cut forward and take one of the baskets and spread the wildflowers around the bully acre, and anybody else that wants to do it as well. So it's if you like a kind of a floral tribute to the people who are interred in this hallowed place. You know, that's it's. I remember the first time I ever come in here, it was in the late 70s or early 80s, and being struck by walking over the ground. And if any of you have got decent footwear, you should walk over. You feel the bumps and the hollows, you know, because the bodies, as they rotted, the ground sank in around them. So it struck me that time, all those years ago, and it's before, I suppose, any of the development, that this is indeed a remarkable place. And as was pointed out earlier, you know, by Fergus, you know, there were auxiliary workhouses not only out at Killyfuddy, out at Killeven. There were auxiliary workhouses in each of the areas here, because the workhouse in this area became so full that initially they opened up extra houses in the town, and on Lower Street, I think it was, or what's Gorta Street now, they were stuffing people into them. And these were people who did not want to be there. Nobody wanted to go to the workhouse. And then, of course, when they got to the workhouse, when they had to go, the able-bodied men weren't allowed in. They had to they had to, if the rebel body, they had to head off on their feet and head for Scotland or whatever, and of course they were all shipped back out of Scotland under the Act about a year later. The flowers, hopefully at some point we'll actually have a wildflower meadow here. Maybe that's something we should work towards in the future. We also, as we're beginning, I'm thinking I might forgetting anything here. I think that's pretty much coming towards the end. But I have to say, before I call on Ciara McCabe here, Ciara, who very kindly agreed to play for us. She was only asked yesterday. Normally we have a piper who comes here, but unfortunately Eamon Curran couldn't be here this year. He sends his very best. He had hoped to be able to get back, but we're what? Hey, look, we got a harp. How bad is that? Isn't it wonderful? But before, yes, thank you, Ciara. But before Ciara plays, if you like, out with a slow air or whatever, again, music for those that have gone. It's worth reflecting on what Fergus and Geraldine talked about, this thing of emigration, and I couldn't help, when listening to Fergus, think of all those people that are coming across on boats across the Mediterranean today. The refugees, the migrants, the despised, the poor of the world that are coming to these shores. And I would ask each and every one of you to remember that that was us at one time. And to put hatred and division and, as Eugene McCabe called it, the dislike of the unlike out of your head. We need to be generous. We need to be warm to the immigrant. We need to be warm to the migrant. And we need to accept that for some people, life is intolerable. If you have bombs dropping on your home or in your country, or if you're being starved because of climate change, what do you do? How do you feed your children? What do? You look for a better life somewhere else, and the West is where the wealth is, because we took most of it from those countries anyway. So please, please, please take the message of this awful period and apply it to today. So look, let me finish by thanking again all of you. Please, next year, third Sunday in May. It's very simple now, and if you could come along and bring your children, grandchildren, anything you have to spread flowers and to spread the love and to keep the memory there. You know, we have less time since this committee commenced its work back in the 1990s. There is less time between now and the bicentenary of the Great Hunger in 2045. There's only so many years. So any of you that are interested in coming on board in the committee, you'll be so welcome. It's very simple. As you see, we keep it simple. So maybe before we ask Ciara to play, we'll have 1 minute of silence or reflective prayer, whatever you like, in memory of the people. And then, Ciara, you just start playing. Go to Mila Margaret.
Thank you.